This is every German aircraft of World War II. Fighters, bombers, transports, reconnaissance planes, gliders, even helicopters. Over 80 machines that shaped the deadliest conflict in human history. Some became legends, some struck terror into Allied crews. Some were so radical they seemed torn from science fiction. From the first day of the invasion of Poland to the final desperate defense of Berlin, these aircraft carried the Luftwaffe through 6 years of total war. First up, fighters and interceptors. Messerschmitt Bf 109. This legendary fighter was the backbone of the German air war and the most produced fighter aircraft in history, with over 33,000 built between 1936 and 1945. Designed by Willy Messerschmitt in response to a 1934 Luftwaffe specification calling for a modern monoplane fighter to replace aging biplanes, the first prototype flew in September 1935. It evolved constantly throughout the conflict, from the early Bf-109B variants that fought in the Spanish Civil War beginning in 1937, through the definitive Bf-109E Emile that dominated the skies over Poland and France, to the high-performance Bf-109G Gustav that equipped the majority of Luftwaffe fighter units from 1942 onward. Pilots flew it on every major front, from the invasion of Poland in September 1939 until the final surrender in May 1945. Its narrow-track landing gear made it tricky to handle on the ground, and the cramped cockpit left pilots exhausted on long missions, but its climb rate, maneuverability at altitude, and powerful armament made it a formidable opponent throughout the war. Aces like Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter pilot in history with 352 victories, flew the 109 exclusively. Focke-Wulf Fw 190. Known by Allied pilots as the Butcher Bird, this fighter was robust, heavily armed, and highly potent. When it first appeared in action over the coast of France during the autumn of 1941, it completely outclassed the Spitfire Mk5 that had previously dominated. Designed by Kurt Tank and powered by a BMW 801 radio engine producing 1,700 horsepower, it combined exceptional speed, reaching 391 miles per hour, with devastating firepower from 2 machine guns and 2 or 4 20mm cannons. It was arguably the best radio-engined fighter of the war, offering a crucial performance alternative to the liquid-cooled Messerschmitt designs. The radial engine proved far more resistant to battle damage than liquid-cooled engines. A single bullet in a coolant line would down a Bf-109, but the Fw-190 could absorb tremendous punishment and bring its pilot home. It served from 1941 through 1945 in fighter, fighter-bomber, and ground attack roles on every front. Focke-Wulf TA-152. Kurt Tank's late-war masterpiece, this was the ultimate evolution of the Fw-190 design. Developed in 1944 and entering limited service in January 1945, it was designed specifically for high-altitude interception of American B-17 and B-24 bomber formations that operated at altitudes where earlier German fighters struggled. Powered by a Junkers Jumo 113 inline engine with a 2-stage supercharger, it could reach speeds exceeding 470 miles per hour at altitude and operate effectively above 40,000 feet. While incredibly fast and sleek with its extended wings and pressurized cockpit, only a handful, perhaps 150 to 220 aircraft, ever reached operational units before the war ended in May 1945. Fuel shortages, pilot training difficulties, and the general collapse of German logistics meant this exceptional fighter arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the war's outcome.
Messerschmitt Bf 110. This was the famous Zerstörer, meaning destroyer. Developed in 1936 as a heavy fighter and entering service in 1939, the twin-engine Bf-110 was formidable in the early campaigns against Poland and France, where its long-range, heavy armament of cannons and machine guns and good speed made it effective against bombers and ground targets. But it struggled badly during the Battle of Britain in 1940, when it encountered nimble single-engine Spitfires and Hurricanes. The Bf-110 proved too slow and unmaneuverable in dogfights, and formations often required their own single-engine fighter escorts. Later in the war, however, the Bf-110 excelled as a dedicated night fighter from 1941 onward, equipped with radar and upward-firing cannons to devastate RAF bomber streams over Germany. Messerschmitt Me-210. A truly troubled design intended to replace the Bf-110 starting in 1939. The Me-210 suffered severe aerodynamic instability, vicious stall characteristics, and structural weaknesses that killed test pilots and frontline crews alike. Production was halted after approximately 350 were built, and the entire airframe was completely reworked with a lengthened fuselage, redesigned tail, and improved engines, transforming it into the successful Me-410. Messerschmitt Me-410, known as the Horness or Hornet. This twin-engine machine solved the stability issues of its predecessor when it entered service in 1943. With a lengthened fuselage that cured the Me-210's deadly handling problems, powerful Daimler-Benz engines, and heavy armament, it served effectively as a reconnaissance platform, heavy fighter, and high-speed bomber destroyer. About 1,160 were produced through 1944, serving primarily on the Western Front against American daylight bomber formations and in the reconnaissance role over Britain and the Mediterranean. Heinkel He Fw, an older biplane fighter representing the previous generation of aerial warfare. Developed in 1933 when Germany was secretly rebuilding its air force in violation of the Versailles Treaty, it became the Luftwaffe's first standard fighter when the service was publicly revealed in 1935. It saw extensive service during the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, supporting Franco's nationalist forces. By the time World War II began in September 1939, it was completely obsolete as a fighter and was relegated almost entirely to advanced training roles. Messerschmitt Me-262, the Schwalbe or Swallow. This was the world's first operational turbojet fighter, and it represented a true revolution in aviation. Development began as early as 1938, but delays in turbojet engine development, changing requirements, and Hitler's insistence that it be modified as a bomber delayed operational deployment until July 1944. Powered by two Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines, it could reach speeds of 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the best Allied piston engine fighters. Its speed made it nearly invulnerable to Allied fighters when handled correctly. Armed with four 30mm cannons, a single burst could destroy a B-17 bomber. Approximately 1,400 were produced, but chronic fuel shortages, insufficient pilot training on jets, and overwhelming Allied numerical superiority meant only a fraction saw combat. Heinkel He 162, the extremely desperate Volksjäger program, meaning People's Fighter. Designed in September 1944 under a specification calling for a jet fighter that could be built quickly and cheaply out of non-strategic materials, primarily wood, by semi-skilled labor, the He 162 flew for the first time in December 1944, just 90 days after the design was approved. Powered by a single BMW 003 turbojet mounted on top of the fuselage, it could reach 520 miles per hour, but its wooden construction and twitchy handling made it extremely dangerous. It was often flown by inexperienced young pilots who had barely trained on the type, and many were killed in accidents rather than combat. Approximately 320 were built before war's end.
Messerschmitt Me 163, the infamous Comet. This was the only rocket-powered fighter aircraft ever to see operational service. Designed by Alexander Lippisch and entering service in 1944, it was a tailless, swept-wing interceptor powered by a Walter HWK 509 rocket motor burning an extremely volatile mixture of T-Stoff and C-Stoff liquid fuels. Its speed was incredible, over 590 miles per hour, making it the fastest aircraft of World War II, but powered flight time lasted only about 8 minutes before fuel exhaustion. Handling the volatile fuel was often more dangerous than combat itself. The propellants were hypergolic, igniting on contact, and leaks frequently dissolved the aircraft and pilot alike. About 370 were built, but none saw combat. Bockum B-349, a radical concept known as the Natter or Adder. This was a vertical takeoff rocket interceptor intended for short-burst, almost suicidal defense against bomber formations. Designed in late 1944, it was essentially a manned surface-to-air missile. The pilot would be launched vertically from a rail, guided by autopilot to bomber formation altitude, fire salvos of unguided rockets, then bail out while the aircraft broke apart. Only one manned test flight occurred on March 1, 1945, ending in the death of test pilot Lothar Sieber. About 370 were built, but none saw combat. Heinkel 219, known as the Uhu or Owl. This was arguably the most effective dedicated night fighter in the Luftwaffe. Designed in 1940, but not flown until November 1942, it entered service in June 1943. It was the first German aircraft fitted with ejection seats and the first Luftwaffe night fighter designed from the outset with radar. On its first operational mission on the night of June 11 to 12, 1943, Major Werner Strabe shot down 5 RAF bombers in 30 minutes. However, political interference limited production to only about 300 aircraft. Dornier DO-335, the extraordinary File or Arrow. This heavy fighter had a unique push-pull engine configuration with one engine in the nose pulling and another in the rear fuselage pushing. First flown in October 1943, it was incredibly fast, reaching 474 miles per hour, holding the distinction as the fastest piston-engined aircraft ever built by Germany. Only about 37 were completed before war's end, far too few to matter. Next up, bombers and attack aircraft. Junkers Ju-87, the notorious Stuka dive bomber. Its terrifying Jericho trumpet siren, a wind-driven whaling device mounted on the landing gear, became a sound of fear during the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 to 1941. Developed in 1935 and entering service in 1936, the Stuka pioneered precision dive bombing tactics. It was devastatingly effective in Poland, France, and the early Eastern Front when the Luftwaffe controlled the skies. However, it proved highly vulnerable without air superiority. During the Battle of Britain, Stuka suffered catastrophic losses to RAF fighters. Over 6,000 were produced through 1944. Junkers Ju-88, the primary bomber version of the most versatile aircraft in German service. Designed in 1936 and first flown in 1938, it was fast and remarkably adaptable. Originally conceived as a high-speed bomber, it was used for level bombing, dive bombing, torpedo attack, reconnaissance, night fighting, and even as a pilotless flying bomb. Over 15,000 Ju-88s of all variants were produced from 1939 to 1945, making it the most produced German bomber. Junkers Ju-188, known as the Ratcher, meaning Avenger. This was an intermediate development based on the Ju-88, entering service in 1943. It featured a new rounded, extensively glazed nose, providing excellent visibility, higher performance engines increasing speed to over 300 miles per hour, and improved defensive armament.
About 1,100 were produced through 1944. Junkers Ju-86, an earlier generation medium bomber developed in 1934 that saw limited use in the Spanish Civil War and early World War II. By 1940, it was obsolete as a bomber, but was famously adapted in 1940 to 1941 as a specialized high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft with pressurized cabin capable of operating above 42,000 feet.
Dornier Do-17, the famous flying pencil. This medium bomber relied on its speed for survival in the early war, and its narrow fuselage gave it a distinct, elegant silhouette. Developed in 1934 originally as a fast mail plane, it was adapted into a bomber and entered service in 1937. It fought in Spain, Poland, and France, and participated heavily in the Battle of Britain. Production ended in 1940, after about 2,000 were built. Dornier Do-215. This was a development of the Do-17, initially planned for export, but absorbed into the Luftwaffe when war made export impossible. It featured more powerful Daimler-Benz engines and was used primarily for crucial reconnaissance tasks. About 100 were built. Dornier Do-217. A powerful, larger bomber design that saw extensive use from 1941 through 1944 in the bomber, night fighter, and anti-shipping roles. It could carry up to 8,800 pounds of bombs and was adapted to launch early guided weapons, including Fritz X radio-guided bombs and HS-293 glide bombs. It was known for its robustness and heavy payload capability. About 1,900 were produced. Heinkel He-111, one of the iconic shapes of the early Luftwaffe, instantly recognizable by its distinctive glazed greenhouse nose. Developed in 1935 ostensibly as a civilian transport to disguise its bomber role, it became Germany's primary medium bomber. It served from the Spanish Civil War in 1936 through 1945, dropping bombs over Warsaw, Rotterdam, London, and countless other cities. Late in the war, He-111s served as launch platforms for V-1 flying bombs. Over 7,300 were produced. Heinkel HS-177, the massive Greif or Griffin. This four-engine heavy bomber, actually using four engines coupled in pairs to drive two propellers, was plagued by severe engine reliability issues and notorious fires. Despite the troubles, it was the only true long-range German heavy bomber to see service. About 1,100 were built through 1944, but chronic mechanical failures meant only a fraction were operationally available at any time. Arado AR-234, known as the Blitz or Lightning. This was the world's first jet-powered bomber and reconnaissance aircraft to enter operational service. First flown in June 1943 and entering service in September 1944, it was powered by two Junkers UMO 004 turbojet engines, giving it a top speed of 460 miles per hour, so fast that intercepting it was virtually impossible. About 210 were produced. Heinkel HS-123. This rugged biplane dive bomber was considered completely obsolete by 1939, yet its incredible toughness and maneuverability ensured it served as an effective close support aircraft until 1944. Developed in 1935 and entering service in 1936, frontline units refused to give them up. About 260 were built. Heinkel HS-129, the dedicated tank buster, nicknamed the can opener. Developed in 1941 specifically for anti-armor work on the Eastern Front, this twin-engine aircraft was heavily armored and often carried a massive 30mm or even 75mm cannon. About 870 were produced through 1944. Focke-Wulf Fw-190F. This version was optimized specifically for the Schlachtflieger, or ground attack role.
Modified from the standard Fw-190A fighter starting in 1942, it featured armor plating and reinforced wings to carry substantial bomb loads. Thousands were produced. Focke-Wulf Fw-190G, a long-range fighter-bomber variant developed in 1943, stripped of some heavy fighter weapons and fitted with external fuel tanks for deep penetration missions. It served primarily on the Eastern Front. Focke-Wulf Fw-200 Condor, known by Winston Churchill as the Scourge of the Atlantic. Developed in 1937 as a luxurious long-range airliner, it was adapted into a military long-range patrol bomber starting in 1939. Operating from French Atlantic bases from 1940 to 1944, Fw-200s hunted Allied convoys. About 276 were built. Heinkel He 115, a very reliable twin-engine float plane designed in 1936 and entering service in 1938. It operated extensively, performing mine-laying, torpedo attacks, and long-range reconnaissance over coastal waters. About 500 were produced. Transport and utility aircraft. Junkers U-32, the legendary Tante U or Auntie Junkers. This tri-motor transport was the tireless workhorse of the Luftwaffe. Developed originally as a civil airliner in 1930 and militarized in 1934, it was rugged, reliable, and could operate from the roughest airstrips. Over 4,800 were produced, and losses were catastrophic, particularly during the Stalingrad airlift, where hundreds were shot down. Junkers U-290, a powerful, very long-range four-engine transport and maritime reconnaissance aircraft. First flown in 1942 and entering service in 1943, it was designed for transatlantic reconnaissance missions. Only about 65 were built. Junkers U-160, a single-engine fast passenger aircraft from the mid-1930s that saw minor military service early in the war, mainly for high-speed liaison and staff transport. Messerschmitt Me-323, the truly immense Gigant, or Giant. This six-engine transport was the largest land-based transport aircraft of World War II, capable of carrying light tanks and up to 130 troops. About 200 were built, but attrition was brutal. Arado AR-232, known as the Tausendfüßler, or millipede. This modern transport featured an innovative multi-wheel landing gear, 11 small wheels under the fuselage, that allowed it to operate from very rough, unprepared airstrips. Only about 20 were built. Junkers U-90, a large four-engine passenger airliner designed in 1936 for Lufthansa. When war came, the few built were converted for military transport duties. Only about 18 were built. Siebel Si-204, a popular light twin-engine transport and multi-engine crew trainer. Over 1,000 were built and used extensively for high-speed liaison duties across occupied Europe. Messerschmitt Bf 108, known as the Typhoon or Typhoon. This elegant, low-wing monoplane was designed in 1934 as a touring aircraft and used primarily for fast communication and liaison. It was the design basis for the later Bf 109 fighter. About 900 were built. Fieseler Fi 156, the famous Stork or Stork. This remarkable aircraft possessed exceptional short takeoff and landing capabilities, unmatched by any other fixed-wing aircraft of the era. Designed in 1935, it could take off in less than 200 feet and land in under 70 feet. Over 2,900 were produced. Siebel FH-104, a modern twin-engine communications and liaison aircraft entering service in 1938, generally used for transporting high-ranking staff officers. Junkers W-34,
a rugged, successful single-engine utility transport developed in 1926, used primarily for training roles and carrying small cargo loads by World War II. About 2,800 were built. Junkers W-33, an influential single-engine transport from the pre-World War II era, developed in 1926 and used mostly for training pilots by 1939. Heinkel He-46, an older parasol-wing reconnaissance biplane developed in 1931. It was largely retired by 1940, but saw initial scouting service during the Polish campaign. Clem KL-31, a light civilian aircraft from the early 1930s that was militarized for basic communications and liaison duties. Clem KL-32, a highly successful three-seater version of the Clem family, developed in 1928, praised for its high performance for a light wooden aircraft. About 200 were built. Reconnaissance and maritime aircraft. Continuing with reconnaissance and maritime aircraft. Focke-Wulf Fw-189, the outstanding reconnaissance aircraft known as the Flying Eye. Designed in 1937 and entering service in 1940, its twin-boom design with extensively glazed central nacelle gave the crew an exceptional field of view. About 850 were built, serving primarily on the Eastern Front. Henschel HS-126, a high-wing monoplane developed in 1936, initially used for tactical observation and short-range reconnaissance. About 600 were built, and it was gradually replaced by the Fw-189 by 1942. Arado RA-234B reconnaissance. This was the dedicated reconnaissance version of the jet bomber. Its incredible 460-mile-per-hour speed allowed it to photograph Allied preparations with virtual impunity.
Heinkel HE-70, the Blitz or Lightning, developed in 1932 as a very fast civilian mail plane, setting multiple speed records. In military service from 1934, it was adapted for reconnaissance and fast liaison. Dornier DO-17P, a specific version of the flying pencil, optimized for long-range photo reconnaissance, entering service in 1938 with special cameras and extra fuel tanks. Blom and Voss BV-138, known as the Flying Shoe due to its unique shape. This sturdy tri-motor flying boat entered service in 1940 and was vital for long-range maritime patrol over the Atlantic. About 280 were built. Blom and Voss BV-222, the colossal Viking or Viking. This was one of the largest flying boats built during World War II. Only 13 were built, serving almost exclusively as strategic transports. Dornier DO-24, a very effective tri-motor flying boat renowned for its excellent seakeeping capability. Designed in 1937, it was used primarily for search and rescue operations. About 280 were built. Dornier DO-18, a sturdy flying boat entering service in 1936, employed for reconnaissance patrols over the North Sea and Atlantic. About 150 were built. Dornier DO-26, a handsome four-engine flying boat with highly advanced retractable flotation gear. Only 6 were built before the war and used for long-range transport and reconnaissance. Heinkel HE-59. This large twin-float biplane, developed in 1931, was initially used for reconnaissance and torpedo bombing. It gained notoriety during the Battle of Britain when painted white with red crosses for supposed rescue missions. About 140 were built. Heinkel HE-60, an aging biplane floatplane developed in 1932 for shipboard reconnaissance, launched via catapult. It was largely replaced by the R-196 by 1940-1941. About 540 were built.
Arado R-196. This was the standard catapult-launched float plane aboard major German warships. Developed in 1938 and entering service in 1939, it was extremely effective, and several successfully engaged Allied submarines and patrol vessels. About 540 were built. Heinkel He 114. An obsolescent biplane float plane designed in 1936, rapidly phased out as better designs became available. About 100 were built. Continuing with gliders. DFS 230. The assault glider famous for the raid on Belgium fortress Ebenemel on May 10, 1940. Developed in 1937, it carried 9 to 10 troops and was a crucial silent transport for airborne forces. About 1,600 were built. Gotha GO-242. A large twin-boom troop and cargo glider developed in 1941. Capable of carrying 23 troops or cargo, it was heavily used for supply missions on the Eastern Front. About 1,500 were built. Messerschmitt Me-321. This was the largest glider of the war, designed in 1940-1941 to carry 200 soldiers or a tank. Its immense size required special towing arrangements, including the unique HE-111Z, two HE-111 bombers joined together. About 200 were built.
Next up, trainers. Focke-Wulf Fw 131, the famous young man or young man. This delightful primary trainer biplane was exceptionally responsive. Developed in 1934, over 5,000 were built, helping establish superb Luftwaffe pilot training standards. Focke-Wulf Fw 133, the incredible young Meister or young master. This advanced aerobatic trainer was legendary for its agility, considered one of the finest aerobatic aircraft ever built. Developed in 1935, about 50 were built for the Luftwaffe. Heinkel He 72, known as the Cadet. This biplane was one of the essential primary trainers in the mid-1930s. Developed in 1933, about 1,000 were built. Clem KL-35. Already mentioned for liaison duties, it was also widely used as a basic and advanced trainer in the 1930s and early war. Arado R-96. A single-engine advanced monoplane trainer developed in 1938, this became the standard advanced trainer of the Luftwaffe during World War II. It was used to introduce student pilots to the handling characteristics of modern operational aircraft before transitioning to fighters or bombers. Over 11,500 were produced, including post-war production in Czechoslovakia as the Avia C-2B, continuing until 1948. Its excellent handling and robust construction made it ideal for training the thousands of pilots the Luftwaffe required. Focke-Wulf Fw-44, known as the Stieglitz or Goldfinch. This was a hugely successful and popular primary biplane trainer. Developed in 1932, many future Luftwaffe aces learned their trade in this aircraft. Over 2,000 were built. Focke-Wulf Fw-56, known as the Stosser. This was a single-seat parasol-wing monoplane serving mainly as a transition trainer for pilots moving into fighter aircraft. Developed in 1933, about 1,000 were built. Focke-Wulf Bu-181, known as the Bestmann. This low-wing trainer was intended to teach pilots the characteristics of modern monoplane fighters. Developed in 1939, over 6,000 were built, serving throughout the war. Arado R-76, a small single-seat parasol-wing monoplane designed in 1934 as both a fighter trainer and potentially an emergency defensive fighter. About 100 were built. Gotha Go-145, a basic, robust two-seater biplane trainer. Developed in 1934, over 10,000 were built. Like many older trainers, it saw late war service as a light nuisance bomber on the Eastern Front, harassing Soviet ground troops. About 10,000 were built.
Arado R-66, a venerable biplane trainer developed in 1932. Despite its age, it was surprisingly utilized as a light nuisance bomber on the Eastern Front, harassing Soviet ground troops. About 10,000 were built.
Focke-Wulf Fw-58, a popular twin-engine aircraft used widely for crew training, light transport, and air ambulance roles. Developed in 1935, its versatility made it valuable. About 1,350 were built. Siebel Si-20Q, a light civilian two-seater aircraft pressed into service for initial flight screening and basic training roles during the war. Helicopters and autogyros. Finally, we have helicopters and autogyros. Focke-Wulf Fw, the Drache, or Dragon. This was a pioneering twin-rotor transport helicopter demonstrating impressive lifting capability. Designed in 1938 and first flown in 1940, it was built in small numbers and intended for transport, reconnaissance, and rescue roles. The Fa-223 could carry loads internally or as external cargo, and equipment varied according to role, including an MG-15 machine gun, two 250-kilogram bombs, a rescue winch and cradle, reconnaissance cameras, and auxiliary fuel tanks. Only about 18 were completed before Allied bombing destroyed production facilities, but those that served demonstrated the potential of rotary wing flight. One survived the war and was flown to Britain for evaluation. Flettner FL-282, known as the Colibri or Hummingbird. This was a groundbreaking reconnaissance helicopter utilizing the Flettner synchronized intermeshing rotor system, where two rotors spun in opposite directions without a tail rotor. Designed in 1940 and first flown in 1941, it was compact, agile, and could reach 93 miles per hour with a range of 110 miles. It was deployed on German warships, including cruisers and destroyers, for observation duties, providing excellent visibility and the ability to hover and land on small deck spaces. About 24 were built, serving primarily in the Mediterranean and Aegean. The FL-282 proved that helicopters could operate successfully from ships, pioneering concepts that would revolutionize naval aviation after the war. Focke-Wulf Fa-330. This highly unusual design was not a true helicopter, but a small collapsible rotary wing kite, unpowered and tethered. It was deployed by U-boats while surfaced far out in the Atlantic to provide much-needed aerial observation. The submarine's forward motion through the water turned the rotor, lifting the Fa-330 and observer several hundred feet above the waves, dramatically extending visual range for spotting Allied convoys. When enemy aircraft or ships approached, the observer could quickly disconnect and parachute to the water while the submarine crash-dived. About 200 were built, serving with U-boat flotillas from 1942 onward. Though their use was limited, deployment required calm seas and time the submarine was vulnerable on the surface.
These were the aircraft of the Third Reich, from the legendary Bf-109 that fought on every front for 6 years to the revolutionary Me-262 jet that arrived too late. From the versatile J-88 that served in a dozen roles to the desperate Volksjäger built from wood and desperation in the war's final months. German aviation pushed the boundaries of what was possible, pioneering jet propulsion, rocket power, swept wings, and helicopter flight. German engineers created machines of remarkable ingenuity and devastating effectiveness. But all the technical brilliance, all the speed and firepower, all the desperate innovation could not change the fundamental equation. Germany fought the world and lost. These aircraft carried young men, many still teenagers, into skies that grew more hostile with each passing month.
Luftwaffe losses were catastrophic. Over 70,000 aircrew killed, more wounded, more captured. Entire training classes were wiped out in weeks. By 1945, fuel starvation grounded revolutionary jets, while Allied bombers turned German cities to rubble with impunity. The most advanced aircraft in the world sat silent on cratered runways, out of fuel, out of pilots, out of time. In the end, these machines became monuments to a regime that squandered brilliant technology in service of evil. And to the thousands of young men who flew them, some believing in a cause, some simply following orders, all caught in the machinery of history's most destructive war. The legacy is complex, technical achievements that advanced aviation for all humanity, won at a cost in blood and suffering that can never be justified.